Yeah, Frame Raider.
Croteam, a once completely unknown Croatian studio of video game developers, started off their branding by creating sports games and various simulations. However, the games they found themselves loving the most at the time were first-person shooters. The team decided to create their own, but found that the rights for licensing top-of-the-line tools and engine technology for development was absurdly expensive. According to Davor Hunsky, founder of Croteam, it would cost potentially upwards of $1 million. In the late months of 1996, they began working on their own engine called Escape 3D. According to Croteam, creating their own engine was the only option since, well, they didn't have $1 million, give or take, to license one. Escape 3D was a 2.5D engine capable of some neat effects that were supposedly designed to help their game feel immersive. This game was called In the Flesh, before some heavy modifications were made to alter the themes, setting, and perhaps even gameplay. Eventually, they settled on a protagonist, a name derived from the equally silly character titled Duke Nukem. For their game, it would follow the adventures of one Serious Sam. They worked strenuously, pouring sweat, blood, and tears into their game, which would feature 40 levels. A hugely ambitious project for their team. As time passed, graphics technology became more advanced. It was clear that they'd have to do a complete rehaul on the game's visuals in order to sell it, but their budget would make this a very complicated task. So, Croteam reached out to somewhere between 20 and 30 publishers to try and pitch their game. As a result, they only heard back from 2 of them. That's all you really need, though, right? Well, sure, if only the publishers were interested in the game, in which they said they were not. As a last effort, they decided to create a technology test demo that, the game explicitly tells you that it is in fact not a demo, despite the later official demo would just be a graphically improved version of the same thing. Alright. They uploaded it online, which finally got some attention. Old Man Murray, a game journalist site known for being rather critical, gave Serious Sam a positive recommendation, which from there got it even more attention. More than 1 million downloads, in fact. Imagine, it's the early 2000s. Something gets more than 1 million downloads. That's not something to scoff at. In the end, Croteam got publishing rights from Gathering of Developers, the same group of people who eventually went to create the now massive Devolver Digital we're all no doubt aware of today. Now, for what reason did I just redocument all of this information that I'm sure you've heard before? Well, it's very important to this game, Serious Sam 2000, or Serious Sam Alpha, or Serious Sam Evaluation Version, or Serious Sam Early Build, whatever you want to call it. This build contains the 40 levels, but the finished game released in 2001, Serious Sam The First Encounter, had only 15. The following isn't documented, but it would only make sense if Gathering of Developers were specifically involved in splitting the game into parts. The first 16 levels of the alpha were set in Egypt, for the most part making up what would be the first encounter. 13 more levels afterwards are more representative of what would become the second encounter. The remaining levels would likely resemble the third encounter. Too bad this build doesn't have anything to show but the level design, which likely would have been changed up dramatically for the non-existing final version of Serious Sam's Alpha anyhow. Screenshots have shown that they did develop these levels further. Alas, this Serious Sam 2000 build we have access to must have been compiled just before they started working on those. That is to say, what makes up the first and second encounters are pretty much all that exist here. The theory is, not much time went into these following stages regardless, so there'd never really be too much to show for it. If anything, you could expect it to be basically more of the same. However, from what we can play and see in screenshots, these levels seem to have more of an emphasis on gravity mechanics and platforming than the other 2 portions of the game. Whether that would dramatically change the feel of these forthcoming levels or not is up for interpretation. Once Croteam began working on the second encounter, at the same time creating their Xbox port of the 2 encounters together into one package, the decision was made to imply the first and second encounters as Serious Sam 1, to be followed up with whatever would become Serious Sam 2. We all know what that turned into, and I have a video on that if you're interested. Before we go any further, I feel it's necessary to say today's video is using the assistance of a source port, more or less. This is Ziditchu's Serious Sam Alpha Remake 1.5. When the Serious Sam Alpha was leaked, many efforts were made to modernize the build for better compatibility. In the end, it took just one man's project to start and finish, one man being Ziditchu, who released his port that was rather frequently updated for a period of time until it was basically finished. That is to say, all the complete levels from Serious Sam's Alpha are available in this remake, which is basically just Serious Sam 2000 rebuilt into the Serious Sam First Encounter build of the game. It's perfectly compatible with the Steam release of the classic First Encounter, which means proper widescreen is granted for your visual pleasure. There's some parts of Ziditchu's remake that are subject to interpretation. Some of the originally empty levels have been stitched together using existing screenshots, and I think there's some new enemy spawns, but the experience remains mostly untouched, even down to the non-negotiably terrible things the alpha did, like having these floating, bobbing ice blocks in the ice planet level that are next to impossible to jump back onto after falling off from. Anyways, I won't be looking at the stuff Zidichu is entirely responsible for with his remake, only the stuff that was directly ported over from the alpha build. So, starting off, you'll notice a bunch of levels with similar names. Why's this? Well, much like the eventual Serious Sam 2 game, levels are split into sub-levels. What you see as Entrance, Middle Yards, and Obelisk Yard make up what is the City of Theba level. King Valley, Tomb of Men's, Tomb of Ramses II, Mental Tomb, Secret Tomb, and King Valley Exit make up what are the King Valley tombs. The same goes on for the majority of the game, until eventually they seem to stop doing this and make huge levels like Green Planet, which you'd expect otherwise to be split into several sub-levels had this been earlier into the game. Let's go ahead and start with the City of Theba. As many dedicated Serious Sam fans will tell you, these levels here didn't make their way into the final version of the game, the first encounter. Instead, they would go completely forgotten until 2012, where Croteam decided to release DLC for their HD remake titled Legend of the Beast, which unknowingly to the community at the time was repurposed from this 2000 build. At least, the landscapes were. Enemy and item spawns completely differed to make it one of the most insufferable Serious Sam experiences to date. Don't play it. The original interpretation of the levels, though, is fine, inoffensive, fairly typical for the start of a game, slowly but surely introducing you to the game's weapons, enemies, and of course, mechanics. An ongoing theme throughout this build is how loosely enemy spawns are thrown all over the place. There isn't much rhyme or reason to it, short for the first time an enemy is introduced to the player, which is nothing overly dramatic, but they do make an effort to shift the player's focus onto the new enemies when they first appear. I do question why this game seems to give the flying Gnar characters such a priority over the walking Gnars that are infinitely more fun to shoot. I mean, the flying ones are just floating heads. Cool that they went to the final game, I guess, but the walking Gnars are far better characters. Next up is King Valley. Of course, this turned into Valley of the Kings in the final game, but the stage had a larger role in the alpha. Here, Sam would use the King Valley to visit multiple different tombs hidden across the desert environment. This deviation lasts for about a half an hour, until you're back to the familiar Egyptian structures. It starts with an oh-so-familiar level, Karnak. Such a level that Croteam had proven to be very fond of, since it was used as the basis for their public tests and eventual demo. A level that they believed was highly polished and gave off a great interpretation of the game. You can tell, even in this earlier build, that they had put a lot of time into this one. I suppose you could say this was the magnum opus of Serious Sam at the time, even though as it progressed I feel it was outclassed by several other levels in the final game. Not the topic for today, though. After this early version of Karnak, we get to the early version of Luxor, which, save for the starting area, is very different. It followed a similar layout in the final game, but the structural elements in between show many different, if simpler, constructs. Then there's the Lake and Alley portion that remains exclusive to the alpha, never revisited by Croteam. It's interesting because, besides the several elongated walking paths, I consider this a pretty decent stage, although personally I do wonder if it's the purely 90s surfer dude aesthetic the Egyptian levels of the game give off that make me feel so giddy when playing it. I mean, just look at this color scheme. Does it not make you feel like you're playing at the beach with beautifully saturated colors covering the place? Palm trees, beach balls, lawn chairs with umbrellas to hide that shade. That's what it feels like to play Egypt in this game. It's almost relaxing in a way. And I think this was an intended feel because, I mean, just listen to the sound of that health pickup. Tell me that doesn't scream 90s surfer dude aesthetic. I can't compare the way this feels to any other first-person shooters I can think of, not even the final release of Serious Sam. The last adventure in Egypt consists of Karnak's temples, specifically the Temple of Babylon and Hatshepsut. Yes, the first level of the final game, Hatshepsut, was initially to take place much further into the game. By the way this is laid out, it was pretty much at the tail's end of the first encounter. The level before it here, Temple of Babylon, is the final level in the HD Remake's DLC. Like the City of Theba stages before it, the philosophy of its design differs greatly. You know, it's really confusing why they chose this level for their Legend of the Beast DLC, when this level had technically already been finalized for the final game, the second encounter's Tower of Babel. A much better re-implementation, in my opinion, would have been the Lake and Alley level. After Babylon comes Pyramid Valley, an absolutely massive stage that'll take you longer to play through than probably any other Serious Sam level out there. There's just one thing though, the level is completely empty. Or rather, it would be if it wasn't the Alpha remake which Zidichu took the opportunity to fill to the brim with monster spawns. It is entirely an interpretation and should not be considered a part of the Alpha design. Next we have the first of 6 different planets, the Water Planet. This is followed by the Lava Planet, the Green Planet, the Ice Planet, the Tropic Planet, and the Rock Planet. For the most part, these would be your second encounter equivalent, even though a lot was changed between this and the eventual second encounter. I'd say the most they have in common are the location settings. There's a lot of greenery in this part of the game, as well as some other shorter focuses into lava and ice environments, even if that was really only shoehorned into the single Land of the Damned stage in the second encounter. I guess they thought, if the next game after second encounter was to be a completely new experience, they wouldn't be able to reuse Serious Engine 1 resources, so they just did their best to make use of them in the second encounter. Just a guess. You might be wondering why Sam goes to 6 different planets. The alpha won't tell you, nor will the remake, because nobody really knows what happens here. In each of the 6 planets, there is a boss fight encounter with an elemental.
No, not the elementals.
Short for one of them with an Elder Dragon Man boss for some reason. You've got the water elemental, fire, ice, wind, and rock. I'm assuming each boss had something on them that Sam needed to get to Sirius. That, or maybe he was required to defeat them to progress. If this is sounding a bit familiar to a certain Serious Sam 2005 sequel, you're catching on quickly. Over the years, Croteam has re-implemented a lot of design ideas from their alpha build, so much so that it's practically comical. Take for example the wind elemental. It can thrust you into the air for a short time, giving you an incredible disadvantage as the onslaught can target your standstill location. This was an idea later used for the Witch Bride in Serious Sam 3. In the lava planet, there's a section where you have to kill and avoid enemy projectiles whilst riding a moving rock fragment on top of a lava stream, just like you do on the clear planet in Serious Sam 2. Sam is visiting different environments like grasslands, volcanoes, and snowy landscapes all within a single campaign, something that Serious Sam 4 has also confirmed to do. Maybe Serious Sam 4 will have even more ideas stripped from their alpha, but that remains to be seen. Now, I find the different planets of Serious Sam's alpha to be very mediocre to the point where I don't really know if I'd recommend playing past the Egypt levels. A lot of the time, they feel very unbalanced, and that isn't just because of Ziditchu's new spawns. There are certain enemy characters that are pretty much broken, really hurting the experience. I guess special thanks goes out to Ziditchu for not fixing these characters in his remake, so I can still talk shit about them. Specifically one of them anyways, but this little bugger is reused so frequently in these last couple stages that they're the biggest sin of the alpha, short for some wearables that this game likes to fetishize placing behind you as you walk forward. Seriously, what the hell is this? But yeah, the Mammoth Men are a joke. They're so tiny that you can barely see them amongst the detailed ground textures that they practically blend into. I mean, look at this costume. The things are already so difficult to spot. Why not make them red or something? What makes this even worse is the render distance for the game. It isn't that great. Mammoth Men can shoot you beyond this render distance. Oftentimes, you'll be getting shot at and you have no idea what direction, what location. You have no information other than that shooting sound and the devilish cackle you hear them murmur when they're near. I'm all but convinced Croteam knew what they were doing when they designed these, and all I can say is thank you to them for scrapping this bastard altogether. It isn't just the enemies that make these later missions fall flat. I guess you can blame it on the whole elemental thing, but these planets often wear their title far too literally. The lava planet is coated with lava, giving barely any room for the player to traverse. Seriously, there are parts where you have to walk perfectly body-sized pathways while enemies are attacking you. Lava flows beneath. There are very few ways to do such a thing and equate to good level design, and as you could guess, this is an example of what not to do. It's also incredibly linear, as are literally all these planet levels. They feel nothing like the ingenuity that was Egypt's level design, which even then feel bloated compared to the final first encounter. The only good thing about these levels are the visuals, because I just have to admit they can look really nice at times, at least in the context of this build. But that isn't going to sell the gameplay for me, and it shouldn't for you either. Yes, the weaponry and to some lengths the enemies are great, but at that point you might as well just play the final games, which is what Croteam surely wanted you to do instead, because they never released these and went with the finals. Serious Sam's alpha is by all means a curiosity piece, with some brilliance glimmering throughout, unfortunately bloated by very long levels. By the end of it, the game becomes a trial of patience as you try to make your way through the uninspired locations that needed a lot of polish. But they probably knew that. It only makes sense that the earlier portion of the game, in Egypt, is much better than the later. Simply put, they had a lot more time to allocate towards these levels. Though it begs the question, were the Egypt levels also terrible before they became finalized? Probably not, because in this early screenshot of In the Flesh, you can see a level that became one of the City of Thebes stages, and it looks pretty identical short for some obstructions and, of course, the more primitive graphics. So these planet levels might have just sucked regardless. To design this game the way they intended back then, they surely would have needed the extra help of a publisher to keep working on it without profits in return before releasing their game. What was likely the enforced direction by their eventual publisher gathering of developers is more than likely what saved this game from extinction. While I'm not saying the individual first-second encounter release approach was necessarily the right one, the truth remains that their goal at the time was just far too ambitious, this build being the absolute proof of that. All you can say in the end is that somebody made the right call. Thanks for watching, and I hope to catch you frame raiders in the next video.